Thunderstorms were nothing new where I grew up. Living in a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town, we were used to the sky lighting up in flashes of white, the rumble of thunder rolling across the fields. But the night of that storm was different. It was late August, the kind of humid evening where the air feels thick enough to choke you. The clouds had rolled in fast, dark and heavy, swallowing the last traces of daylight. I was at home with my parents and my little sister Lila, who'd just turned 7 a few weeks earlier. We were in the living room, watching some old movie we'd seen 100 times before, when the first crack of thunder shook the house. Lila jumped, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. "It's just thunder," Mom said, pulling her into a hug. "It can't hurt you." But the lightning that followed was so bright it lit up the whole room, casting long, sharp shadows on the walls. "Looks like a bad one," Dad muttered, getting up to check the windows. The rain came next, a torrential downpour that hammered against the roof and windows, drowning out the sound of the TV. "We'll lose power," Mom said, more to herself than anyone else. She got up to find the candles and flashlights, just in case. I glanced at Lila, who was staring at the window, her face pale. "It's just a storm," I said, trying to sound reassuring. But even as I said it, something about the night felt wrong. It wasn't just the storm. There was a tension in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. "Great," Dad muttered, his voice laced with frustration. Mom returned a moment later, a flashlight in one hand and a candle in the other. "Let's just wait it out," she said, setting the candle on the coffee table. The flickering flame cast eerie shadows across the walls, making everything look warped and unfamiliar. And that's when we heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from somewhere upstairs. "What was that?" Lila whispered, clutching her rabbit tighter. "It's just the storm," Mom said quickly, though her voice was tighter than before. But the tapping didn't sound like rain. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I glanced at Dad, who was already getting up from his chair. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing the flashlight and heading toward the stairs. "Be careful," Mom called after him, her voice barely above a whisper. The rest of us sat in silence, listening to the sound of his footsteps creaking up the stairs. The tapping stopped. Then came another sound, a faint, almost imperceptible creak, like a door opening. "Dad," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. The rain pounded against the windows, the wind howling through the trees outside. "Stay here," Mom said, getting up and grabbing the other flashlight. "Wait," Lila cried, her voice panicked. "It's okay," Mom said, forcing a smile. "I'll just see what's taking him so long." She disappeared up the stairs, the flashlight beam bobbing with her movements. Lila and I sat in the flickering candlelight, the shadows on the walls seeming to move and shift on their own. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. "Why aren't they coming back?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my stomach tightening with unease. Just then, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable creak of the attic door opening. "Why would they go into the attic?" I said aloud, more to myself than to Lila. She didn't answer. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if someone or something was stomping across the attic floor. Then they stopped, and the house fell silent again, except for the sound of the storm outside. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight from the table. Lila's eyes widened in fear. "Don't leave me," she cried, grabbing my arm. "I'll be right back," I promised, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. I made my way to the stairs, the flashlight shaking in my unsteady grip. The air grew colder as I ascended, each step creaking loudly beneath my feet. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the pounding rain. No response. When I reached the top of the stairs, I turned toward the attic door. It was wide open, the darkness inside swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. "Mom? Dad?" I called again, stepping closer. The air in the hallway felt wrong. Heavier, colder, like something unseen was pressing down on me. I hesitated at the foot of the attic stairs, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and go back downstairs. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the attic. It wasn't a word, just a soft, breathy sound, barely loud enough to be heard over the storm. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mom!" I whispered. The whisper stopped. Then came the sound of something heavy dragging across the attic floor. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the top of the attic stairs, staring down at me. The figure at the top of the attic stairs was gone as soon as the flashlight flickered back to life. For a moment, I stood frozen, the beam shaking in my trembling hand. The storm outside roared louder, thunder cracking so violently it made the walls shudder. "Mom? Dad?" I called again, my voice cracking. A muffled sound answered from somewhere deeper in the attic, like a thud, followed by a faint scraping. I turned back toward the hallway, my instincts screaming at me to get Lila and run. But I couldn't leave without them. Taking a deep breath, I climbed the attic stairs, the wood creaking beneath my weight. The attic was freezing, and the wind howled through small gaps in the roof, carrying with it the faint scent of mildew and damp wood. My flashlight swept across the cluttered space, illuminating old boxes, furniture draped in dusty sheets, and a broken rocking chair near the far wall. There was no sign of Mom or Dad. I moved cautiously, the beam of the flashlight darting from one shadowed corner to another. Then I saw it, a pair of muddy footprints leading across the attic floor, weaving between the clutter. They were fresh, the dirt still wet, and they weren't from any of us. I followed the trail to the far wall, where a small, square window rattled in its frame. Rain streaked the glass, and flashes of lightning lit up the woods behind the house. "Mom? Dad?" I called again, my voice barely above a whisper. The flashlight beam caught something on the floor, two wet, muddy handprints smeared across the planks. They led to a trapdoor in the floor that I hadn't noticed before. The door was slightly open, the faint sound of the storm filtering through the gap. "Are you down there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I crouched down, gripping the edge of the door, and pulled it open. The wind howled louder, and the flashlight beam illuminated a short, narrow staircase leading down to what looked like a crawl space. The air that hit me was freezing, carrying with it the metallic tang of damp earth. "Hello," I called, peering into the darkness. I thought I heard a faint whisper, but it was drowned out by another deafening crack of thunder. The storm raged outside, the sound almost overwhelming. And then I saw it. A shadow moved at the bottom of the stairs, darting out of sight before I could make out its shape. My heart hammered in my chest. "Mom? Dad?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing. I backed away from the trapdoor, slamming it shut and stumbling toward the attic stairs. Whatever was down there, it wasn't them. I hurried back to the hallway, my legs shaking. "Lila!" I called, my voice echoing through the dark house. She was still in the living room, clutching her stuffed rabbit and staring at the flickering candle. "Did you find them?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I admitted, sitting beside her and gripping the flashlight tightly. The storm was relentless now, the wind howling like a living thing. The windows rattled in their frames, and the roof groaned under the weight of the rain. "I'm scared," Lila whispered. "Me too," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. The candle flame flickered violently, then went out, plunging us into darkness. A loud crash came from the back of the house, like something heavy had fallen. Lila screamed, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her close. "It's just the storm," I said, though I didn't believe it. We stayed frozen like that for what felt like hours, the storm's fury unrelenting. Then, through the sound of the rain and wind, I heard it, footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, moving through the kitchen toward the living room. I shone the flashlight toward the hallway, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, The house was silent except for the storm. Then the footsteps started again, this time moving faster. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lila and pulling her toward the front door. We fumbled with the lock, the metal cold and slippery under my fingers. The footsteps were right behind us now, loud and unrelenting. I threw the door open and we ran out into the storm. The rain was blinding, the wind so strong it nearly knocked us over. "Over here!" I shouted, dragging Lila toward the old shed at the edge of the yard. The shed door creaked as I pushed it open, and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The small space reeked of damp wood and gasoline, and the only light came from the faint glow of the flashlight. Lila was crying, clutching her rabbit so tightly her knuckles were white. "It's okay," I lied, holding her close. We stayed like that, huddled together, as the storm raged outside. Then we heard it, a scraping sound coming from the shed door. It was slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their nails across the wood. Lila whimpered, and I clamped a hand over her mouth, motioning for her to stay quiet. The scraping stopped, replaced by the faint sound of breathing just outside the door. I raised the flashlight, my heart pounding as I prepared for the door to burst open. But it didn't. Instead, something slid under the door. A small piece of paper, soaked and wrinkled from the rain. I hesitated, then reached for it with trembling fingers. Scrawled across the paper in jagged handwriting were two words: "Go back." The breathing outside the door stopped, and the footsteps started again, this time moving back toward the house. Lila clutched my arm, her small fingers digging into my skin as we stared at the soggy note. "Go back." The words made no sense. "Do you think it's Mom or Dad?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer. The wind outside screamed, rattling the shed walls and making the roof creak ominously. We couldn't stay here. I glanced at Lila, her face pale and streaked with tears. "We have to get back to the house," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "They might be there." She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "But what if?" "We don't have a choice," I interrupted. Grabbing the flashlight, I cracked the shed door open, wincing as the cold rain hit my face. The yard was a blur of shadows and streaking water, the storm showing no sign of letting up. "Stay close to me," I told Lila, and we stepped into the storm. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and hollow. With each step, the mud sucked at our shoes, slowing us down. When we reached the porch, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I'd left open, was now shut. I tried the knob, it was locked. "Why is it locked?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. I didn't answer. I pounded on the door. "Mom, Dad, it's us." The house remained silent. We circled to the back, my flashlight cutting through the sheets of rain. The back door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "Stay behind me," I told Lila as I pushed it open. The kitchen was a mess. Cabinets hung open, their contents scattered across the floor. A chair lay on its side, and the faint smell of something burnt lingered in the air. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, my voice echoing through the house. The silence was deafening. Then Lila tugged on my sleeve. "What's that?" she asked, pointing toward the kitchen table. I turned the flashlight to where she was looking and felt my stomach drop. Sitting on the table was Dad's flashlight, the one he'd taken upstairs earlier. Next to it was Mom's phone, the screen cracked, but still on. "They were here," I said, my voice shaking. As I stepped closer, I noticed something else. A trail of muddy footprints led away from the table, disappearing into the hallway. But this time they weren't heading outside. They were leading to the basement door. "No," Lila said, shaking her head. "We can't go down there." I looked at her, my stomach twisting with fear. "They might need our help," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The basement door was slightly ajar, revealing the top of a staircase that disappeared into the darkness below. The air seeping through the gap was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. "Stay here," I told Lila, handing her the flashlight. "No," she cried, grabbing my arm. I'll be fine, I said, trying to reassure her. She didn't let go. Okay, I relented. Then stay close. Together, we descended the stairs, each step creaking loudly beneath our weight. The basement was pitch black, the flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the concrete walls. The air was colder down here, and the smell of damp earth was stronger. Do you see anything? Lila whispered. I shook my head, my eyes scanning the space. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of boxes, and tools hanging from the walls. But then the flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was a large, open hatch in the floor. The edges of the hatch were lined with fresh mud, and a rope ladder hung down into what looked like a deep tunnel. What is that? Lila asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said, stepping closer. The tunnel was too dark to see the bottom, but the faint sound of water dripping echoed up from below. Did they go down there? Lila asked. Before I could answer, we heard it. A faint cough, coming from somewhere inside the tunnel. Mom! I called out, my voice shaking. The cough came again, louder this time. Wait here, I told Lila, grabbing a lantern from the workbench and lighting it. No! She cried, grabbing my arm. We have to find them, I said, though every instinct was screaming at me to turn around and run. I climbed down the rope ladder, the lantern swinging with every step. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the walls slick with moisture. The further I went, the colder it got, the air thick and hard to breathe. Mom? Dad? I called again, my voice echoing down the passage. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, and that's when I saw them. Mom and Dad were sitting against the far wall, their faces pale and their clothes soaked with mud. Are you okay? I asked, rushing to their side. Mom nodded weakly, her hands trembling. What happened? I asked, glancing around the room. Dad opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. He's still here, he said. Who? I asked, my stomach dropping. Before he could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned toward the tunnel entrance, the lantern casting long, flickering shadows. The footsteps stopped, and a figure stepped into the light. It wasn't someone I recognized. The figure that stepped into the tunnel's light wasn't a monster or ghost. It was a man, but something about him felt wrong. He was tall and wiry, his clothes caked in dirt and rain, and his face was gaunt, his hollow eyes fixed on me. In his hand, he held a long, rusted wrench. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the dim lantern casting flickering shadows on the damp walls. Mom groaned weakly beside me, and the man's gaze shifted to her. Who are you? I demanded, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel floor, and I instinctively raised the lantern higher, the light casting his features into sharper relief. His lips twisted into a faint, humorless smile. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice low and gravelly. I stepped in front of Mom and Dad, my heart pounding. We didn't mean to, I said quickly. We're just trying to leave. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. This tunnel isn't for you, he said, his tone almost conversational. He tapped the wrench against his palm, the metal clinking softly. It's mine. My hands shook as I tried to figure out what to say. We're leaving, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We don't want any trouble. The man laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the walls. You already found trouble, he said, taking another step forward. Behind me, Mom whimpered, and I could hear Lila crying softly at the top of the rope ladder. Please, I said, my voice cracking. We have a little girl up there. Just let us go. The man's smile faltered slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might actually let us leave. But then he shifted the wrench in his hand, gripping it tighter. You shouldn't have come down here, he muttered, more to himself than to us. I glanced back at Mom and Dad, their faces pale and drawn. Dad met my eyes, his expression urgent. "Get Lila," he whispered. I hesitated, torn between protecting them and getting my sister to safety. "Go," Dad said, his voice firmer this time. I turned and scrambled up the rope ladder, my hands slipping on the wet rope as I climbed. Lila was waiting at the top, her face streaked with tears. "Is Mom okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She's fine," I lied, grabbing her hand. "We have to get out of here." We stumbled back into the basement, the air feeling even colder now. The storm outside roared louder, the wind slamming against the house like it was trying to tear it apart. I grabbed Lila and pulled her toward the stairs, but before we could reach them, I heard a loud crash from below. The rope ladder jerked violently, and I realized the man was climbing up. "Go!" I shouted, practically shoving Lila toward the stairs. We bolted up the steps and into the kitchen, slamming the basement door shut behind us. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. Lila sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her stuffed rabbit as she leaned against the counter. "What's happening?" she cried. "It's going to be okay," I said, though I didn't believe it. The sound of something heavy slamming against the basement door made us both jump. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, praying it would hold. Another crash echoed through the house, this time from the front door. My heart sank as I realized the man wasn't alone. "Lila, hide," I whispered, pushing her toward the pantry. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm not leaving you. You have to," I said firmly. She hesitated, then crawled into the pantry, her small frame barely fitting among the shelves. The storm outside seemed to grow angrier, the wind howling like a living thing. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, my hands trembling as I turned to face the door. The crashing stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the house. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My grip on the knife tightened as I braced myself. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen. "Get out of my house," I shouted, my voice shaking. There was no response. Then, from the shadows of the hallway, the man stepped into view. He was alone, his wrench hanging loosely at his side. "This isn't your house," he said, his tone eerily calm. I took a step back, the knife trembling in my hand. "Leave us alone," I said, my voice breaking. The man tilted his head, his empty eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't have gone into the tunnel," he said. His grip on the wrench tightened, and he took a step forward. "Stay back," I shouted, holding the knife out in front of me. The man stopped, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, from behind me, came a sound I'll never forget, the faint click of the pantry door opening. Lila stepped out, her face streaked with tears, her small hands clutching the flashlight. "Leave my brother alone," she screamed, shining the beam directly into the man's eyes. He recoiled, raising the wrench to block the light. I didn't wait. I lunged forward, slashing at his arm with the knife. He let out a yell, dropping the wrench as blood seeped through his sleeve. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lila's hand and pulling her toward the back door. We burst into the storm, the rain blinding and cold as we stumbled into the yard. Behind us, the man's shouts faded into the wind, drowned out by the fury of the storm. We didn't stop running until we reached the neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they let us in. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. When they searched the house and the tunnel, the man was gone. But they found Mom and Dad, shaken but alive, huddled at the far end of the tunnel. The officers couldn't explain the tunnel, who built it, or why it was there. And as for the man, he was never found. The days after that storm were a blur of police interviews, late-night calls, and restless sleep. Mom and Dad were taken to the hospital that night, treated for dehydration and minor injuries. They told the police everything they remembered, that they had gone to check on a noise upstairs and ended up in the tunnel, forced down by the same man who'd terrorized us. They didn't know how long they'd been there, only that he kept saying, over and over, "This is my place. You don't belong here." The tunnel itself became the center of attention. Authorities roped off the property, digging into its history. As it turned out, the house had belonged to an old man decades ago, someone who'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But the tunnel? It wasn't in any public records. When they asked us about the man, we described him as best we could. Tall, wiry, dirty clothes, and hollow eyes that didn't seem human. The police didn't find him, though. Not in the house, not in the woods, and not in the tunnel. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. That should have been comforting. But it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for us to come back. Lila had nightmares for weeks after that night. She'd wake up screaming, convinced the man was hiding in her closet or under her bed. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, I didn't feel safe either. We moved out of the house not long after. Mom and Dad said it was because of the memories, but I think we all knew the real reason. The house wasn't ours anymore. It belonged to the man in the tunnel. Months later, I found myself sitting in my new bedroom, staring out at the quiet street below. The rain was falling softly, the kind of rain that usually made me feel calm. But that night, it only reminded me of the storm. As I lay in bed, the sound of the rain lulling me to sleep, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft, deliberate knock at the window. When I turned to look, the window was empty. But on the glass, written in the fog of my breath, were two words. Still here. ND realism you wanted.